Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It is indeed my privilege today to rise in this House for the purpose of expressing my support for Bill S-15, and in particular for taking the necessary action to protect Sable Island as a National Park Reserve under the Canada National Parks Act. Now, throughout this debate and subsequent examination of Bill S-15 by a committee of the House, we're being asked to preside over an historic event, Mr. Speaker, the creation of a new national park. This is a unique opportunity for all the members of this House. In effect, Mr. Speaker, we're being asked to make a clear and a conscious decision to protect Sable Island for all time. We're being handed the opportunity to pass on this iconic island with its famed wild horses and important wildlife habitat to future generations. We're providing to our children, Mr. Speaker, a legacy of natural area and all its inherent stories for them to enjoy and to pass on to the next generation. It might seem at first glance that this is a rather short and inconspicuous piece of legislation. But in reality, Mr. Speaker, this is the key to ensuring that Sable Island will, as the dedication clause of the Canada National Parks Act states, be dedicated to the people of Canada for their benefit, for their education, and for their enjoyment, and it shall be maintained and made use of so as to leave it unimpaired for the enjoyment of many future generations. Mr. Speaker, I stand in this House in support of making that decision by speaking in favor of Bill S-15. Mr. Speaker, I can only imagine standing on the beaches of Sable Island wondering, how did this island come to be? I can imagine asking how it is that in the midst of the Atlantic Ocean, perched on a lonely outcrop of the continental shelf, that this sandbar survives all the ocean can pound it with. How is it that so many ships came to their last port of call on Sable Island as one of hundreds of shipwrecks? How is it that horses and endangered birds survive on this desolate outpost of dunes and sparse vegetation? And Mr. Speaker, what sheer idealism moves some of the current residents to spend months out here guarding this island on behalf of all Canadians? Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the initiatives that Parks Canada is going to undertake to share the rich story of Sable Island and to answer these and other questions. Perhaps a more direct question to consider this evening as we debate the proposal to protect Sable Island under the Canada National Parks Act is how did we get to the point of designating Sable Island as a national park forever? Well, early conservation efforts regarding Sable Island were merely targeted and reactive. As we've heard, the government passed regulations as long ago as 1961 to protect the horses of Sable Island from being removed from the island. Well, these were called the Sable Island Regulations, and they specifically protect the island through restrictions that are aimed at controlling access and controlling certain types of activities. In the late 1960s, the Department of Transport put an end to plans to remove mineral-rich sands from the surface of this island, even after the entire island had already been staked. So the story goes on. A more forward-looking conservation approach to Sable Island was first adopted in 1977 when Sable Island was designated as a migratory bird sanctuary under the Migratory Bird Convention Act. The purpose of this designation was to protect migratory birds, including their nests and their eggs, a very important thing to do. However, a migratory bird sanctuary in itself does not protect the other wildlife species or their habitat on Sable Island. In addition, the regulations only apply when migratory birds are actually nesting, and so they are not an effective conservation tool for the rest of the year. So on things developed, and more recently, specific areas of the island have also been designated as critical habitat for the endangered roseate tern under the Species at Risk Act. And then, Mr. Speaker, in 1998, working with the province of Nova Scotia and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Environment Canada's Canadian Wildlife Service prepared a document, a key document titled a Conservation Strategy for Sable Island. And the overall goal was to set a framework for the preservation of the physical integrity and biological diversity of Sable Island. And I note that that was initiated under a former government, Mr. Speaker. Observing that while the island had been used by humans for over 400 years, and that this use had in fact changed the island, permanently altering its pre-contact ecosystem, yet it was time to develop a conservation strategy to define the environmental limits within which future activities should proceed. In short, Mr. Speaker, the essence of the strategy was to protect the existing terrain from human-induced destabilization and to conserve the island's flora and fauna. That was 1998. Now, of particular interest to our debate tonight, Mr. Speaker, is that part of the strategy dealing with the legal designation of Sable Island. The authors of the document observed that while the application of the Sable Island regulations and the Migratory Birds Convention Act quotes have been relatively effective in protecting Sable Island, there are many parts of the island's natural environment which do not receive adequate protection under the law, end quotes. So as a result, the strategy wisely recommended that enhanced legal protection should be sought that provides more comprehensive protection to the island's natural values. So that's what we've been moving toward all of these years. Finally, Mr. Speaker, in June of 2008, under the present government, finally, work to designate Sable Island as a federal protected area was first announced by the Honourable Member for Ottawa West Nepean. At that time, he announced funding under the Health of the Oceans Initiative to maintain a year-round weather station on Sable Island. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, that it's worth recounting the words of the Honourable Member from that day. Please. And this is what he said. He said, quote, "We believe that it is in the best interest of Canadians to ensure that Sable Island is preserved for generations to come. Today's announcement is further proof of our government's commitment to protecting and preserving our environment in Atlantic Canada," end quote. These were prescient words, Mr. Speaker, because with that announcement, the journey to this very evening and to Bill S-15 was underway. It was in 2009, as the Government of Canada and the province of Nova Scotia were discussing progress on the protection of Sable Island, that the idea of protecting the island as a national park was first introduced. And so, Mr. Speaker, in January 2010, the two governments signed a Memorandum of Understanding, an MOU, respecting the establishment of a federal protected area on Sable Island in the province of Nova Scotia. Finally, after all those years, a government was willing to move. Recognizing that Sable Island possesses national significance, the two governments agreed to work together to determine if Sable Island should be protected as a national wildlife area under the Canada Wildlife Act or as a national park under the Canada National Parks Act. By the terms of the agreement, the governments appointed a task force for the purpose of recommending which type of federal protected areas should be embraced. This was going to be a well-thought-out process, Mr. Speaker. It's important to note that from day one of the process, that MOU between the two governments was clear. I'll quote it. "No recommendation regarding the potential designation or creation of a federal protected area for Sable Island will have an adverse impact on Canada's or Nova Scotia's interest in offshore petroleum resources including those in the Sable Island area." End quote. So it was clear from the start that no matter what type of protected area was recommended, it had to take into account the existence of the Offshore Petroleum Resource Accord Implementation Act, a mouthful, but really something that took precedence over all other federal legislation in this region, previously negotiated with the province, and of course it had to also take into account the role of the Offshore Petroleum Board itself. So what came next in this rather fascinating history of developments? Well, it was on Earth Day, April 22nd, 2010, that the Canada-Nova Scotia Sable Island Task Force recommended to the Government of Canada and the Province of Nova Scotia that Sable Island should be designated as a national park under the Canada National Parks Act. In comparing the two types of federal protected areas, the task force concluded that the national park designation would convey a number of additional public benefits, including the following. First, as a national park, Sable Island would be protected and presented within a national network of national parks and would be recognized as one of Canada's premier natural and cultural icons. Second, while petroleum resources would remain available to industry offshore, a national park places a stronger emphasis on the protection from exploitation and development of non-petroleum resources found in the subsurface of Sable Island. I'll repeat that: a stronger emphasis on the protection from exploitation and development of non-petroleum resources. Next, as a national park, the designation brings a stronger emphasis to the conservation and preservation of archaeological and cultural resources, also an important factor. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the diversity of program objectives required in a national park, which include protection, visitor experience, and engagement with stakeholders, would better serve to maintain a year-round human presence on the island. Now, in their conclusion, the task force noted something that many associated with Sable Island have come to learn, and that is the strong appreciation and passion and depth of interest that citizens share for the future of Sable Island. It was also clear through the work of the task force that all sectors were committed to achieve a renewed future for Sable Island. Mr. Speaker, perhaps that speaks to what we are trying to accomplish with Bill S-15, and that is a renewed future for Sable Island. So, Mr. Speaker, in May of 2010, the two governments announced their decision to undertake consultations and to negotiate an agreement for the designation and protection of Sable Island under the Canada National Parks Act. Now, you might ask, what did the public think of this idea of turning Sable Island into a national park? Well, this is quite an important consideration as we consider the merits of Bill S-15, Mr. Speaker. So during the summer of 2010, Parks Canada held 3 open houses in Halifax where over 200 people attended. And many took the time to have in-depth discussions with Parks Canada staff and to submit written submissions. Online submissions, emails, letters, telephone messages in response to Parks Canada's webpage, newsletter, and advertisements were also received. Mr. Speaker, you will be astounded to learn that Parks Canada received over 2,800 responses, including 235 detailed submissions. As Parks Canada observed in its report on these consultations, the volume and quality of responses Parks Canada received are a testament to the strong link that many Nova Scotians and Canadians across this country feel for this very special place. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, the agency noted, and I'll quote again, "Sable Island and its isolated sand dunes hold a special place in the hearts and minds of Canadians. Nova Scotians, where I have my roots, feel a particular tie to Sable, as it figures prominently in their history and looms large in their imagination. The passion and great interest that Canadians have in Sable Island was evident in the submissions that Parks Canada received from across Canada and even from abroad, expressing support and highlighting ideas and concerns and vision for the future of Sable Island as a national park. So, Mr. Speaker, what were the views of Canadians on the idea of designating Sable Island a national park? What did they have to say? Well, in general, Parks Canada reported that Canadians support the proposed national park designation. They feel it's important to maintain the ecological integrity and protect the cultural resources of Sable. They're interested in visitor experience opportunities on the island that, however, are limited in scope and scale and are, of course, well managed. And they want off-island experiences and educational opportunities. Canadians are also seeking careful management of natural resources, including petroleum, and last but certainly not least, they are concerned about wildlife management. Buoyed by the strong support that these consultations revealed for protecting Sable Island as a national park, officials moved to complete the negotiation of a memorandum of agreement for a national park at Sable Island. And, Mr. Speaker, the next step in this great story is that on October 17, 2011, our Minister of the Environment and Minister responsible for Parks Canada joined with the Honourable Darrell Dexter, Premier of Nova Scotia, in signing the National Park Establishment Agreement. And Bill C-15 seeks to put into legislation many of the elements of that 2011 National Park Establishment Agreement, including some very important things that I'm going to mention. First of all, a ban on drilling from the surface of Sable Island out to 1 nautical mile. Second, a restriction of surface access rights for petroleum-related activities to only 4 very limited and very specific activities. And finally, a requirement for the Offshore Petroleum Board to consult Parks Canada should it consider authorizing even any of those 4 very limited activities. In recognition of the province of Nova Scotia's ongoing interest in the future of Sable Island, the Establishment Agreement also provides for a Canada-Nova Scotia committee to enable the province to provide input and advice respecting the operation of the National Park Reserve. And in addition, subject to reasonable conditions, Parks Canada will permit Nova Scotia to continue to carry out environmental, climate change, and weather and air monitoring programs on Sable Island, as well as scientific research. So, Mr. Speaker, as we bring to a close this first part of the journey to renew the future of Sable Island, it's important to not forget those whose personal and professional dedication to this island has left us with this marvelous opportunity. I'm thinking of those officials of the Canadian Coast Guard, the Meteorological Service of Canada, and the Canadian Wildlife Service, who for decades watched over Sable Island for the rest of us. And I'm also thinking of those individuals and organizations such as the longtime resident and volunteer guardian Zoe Lucas, and also the Green Horse Society and the Sable Island Preservation Trust. I'm thinking of the province of Nova Scotia and companies like ExxonMobil, who have acted in the public good by always keeping conservation of Sable Island in the forefront of their actions in this region. I would call on this chamber to thank the province of Nova Scotia, which on May 10th of this year gave royal assent to their bill amending the legislation to put into place the legislated ban against drilling. And it now rests with this chamber to complete our work so that both governments will be able to give effect to their respective acts, thereby finally protecting Sable Island in law under the National Parks Act. I could say much more. I want to mention that Parks Canada will continue its work with the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia, but in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I'm just very proud to have had the opportunity to speak in favor of Bill S-15 and to put on record my support for renewing the future of Sable Island as a National Park Reserve under the Canada National Parks Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Maquarel-Fortin. Mr. Speaker, it's very pleasant today. We're being given a national park, and my goodness, that's always a good thing, and this one is a particularly beautiful one. I have traveled the shore of Nova Scotia, and these are heavy seas sometimes, but it's always beautiful. We have a beautiful country, and now, collectively, in this House, we're going to guarantee that we have an extra little piece that's just for us, and make sure that we leave a legacy that's a bit larger than the one we received ourselves. At least we'll make sure that we give at least the same and not less. But the problem, and this is the crux of the matter, Mr. Speaker, it's that unfortunately the present government's green track record may not be what it should be. So I'd like to hear my honourable colleague tell me that I'm right to be enthusiastic, that we're going to get a great park and that it will never be threatened.
Sure. I thank my cher colleague from across the way for that question, which would in some respects be considered a lob question. I appreciate it because it gives me the opportunity to reassure him based on the government's record. And I want to say that since 2006, Parks Canada has realized an astounding number of environmental achievements, and these include the six-fold expansion of the boundary of Nahanni National Park Reserve to over 30,000 square kilometers. Parks Canada was awarded the Royal Canadian Geographic Society Gold Medal, the highest honor of that society for this achievement. There has also been the creation of the Guayahanas National Marine Conservation Area and Haida Heritage Site, the creation of Lake Superior National Marine Conservation Area at more than 10,000 square kilometers, including lake bed, islands, North Shore lands. This is the largest freshwater marine protected area in the world. The successful reintroduction of plains bison and the black-footed ferret, an animal once thought to be extinct, the establishment of the Soyo Adasho National Historic Park. Over the last 5 years, actions on the ground projects, restoring forest health in Grossmore National Park, restoring stream connectivity in Atlantic National Parks, dune ecosystem restoration in Pacific Rim National Reserve, Little Port Jolly Estuary restoration in Kaminchukuk. But I see I'm running out of time, so my colleague will have to wait till my next answer.
The questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Etobicoke North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd really like to thank my colleague. It was important to lay out the history of the park. I do have a question regarding Clause 7. What will be the new mechanism for coordination and cooperation between Parks Canada and the Offshore Petroleum Board? This is key, as in the amendments to the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Resources Accord Implementation Act, it states, quote, before deciding whether to issue the authorization, the board shall consider any advice. That is, the offshore board is not bound to the recommendations of Parks Canada. Who is looking after the interests of the environment in Sable Island if the offshore board is not bound by the decision? I also understand from Parks Canada that the MOU defining the rules of the relationship will be put in place after the park is established.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you very much. I appreciate my friend's question, which is important and to the point. And I think that my friend is, my colleague rather, across the way is well familiar with the variety of mechanisms which are in place whenever an undertaking of the nature that she describes is begun in Canada. And among other things, whether it's the Offshore Petroleum Board or any other agency which is engaged in approving of such projects, there is an assessment which is done, which is generally speaking quite strenuous and would be performed in such a case. And I don't have any reason to doubt that the assessments performed by the Offshore Petroleum Board would be any less stringent than any of the others that we conduct on an almost daily basis right across this country. And of course, those would also be subject to the limitations in this amendment to the Act, which require no drilling within 1 nautical mile of the island, rather, and also very, very strict conditions for necessary limited activities on the island.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Wetaskiwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his more than enthusiastic speech. It was a pleasure for me to serve alongside him on the Environment Committee for a long time. He is an excellent examiner on that committee, gets to the root of the matter very quickly, understands the truth from the, well, it separates the wheat from the chaff, as we like to say on the prairies, Mr. Speaker, and always gets to the heart of the matter. My question for him is, he just spoke in his speech quite extensively about the current protections that will be afforded under being part of a national parks system under a National Parks Act and the park preserve status. I'm just wondering if he can elaborate and tell us what the difference is. He mentioned the Migratory Birds Convention Act protection and some of the other protections that were in place, but if he could expand on the differentiation of truly the difference in the levels of protection and what's going to happen insofar as not only this park, but all the other parks and protected areas that this government has created insofar as the long-term preservation of species, of our ecosystems, and the biological and genetic integrity of all of the wildlife that we have in Canada.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my colleagues' kind comments, and actually the respect I have for him is such that I take it as very high praise indeed when he says such kind things about me, because he himself is well accomplished in this place, and particularly in areas of environmental management. And indeed, that's where I'll pick up, because as a national park area, the area in question, Sable Island, as well as any national park, is subject to management and to careful husbandry and protection of habitat and species, and controlled access by the public, not no access. It would defeat the point of national parks if there was no access by the public, but the usage of a park is regulated and managed in a way that will in fact maximize the natural biodiversity. And so that's the kind of approach that I expect to take with this park. In addition, Mr. Speaker, may I say that our national parks are a way of connecting Canadians to nature and getting people to care about our natural environment. And it's often said that that's what's the mark of a true Canadian, is a love for the outdoor natural environment. And our national parks very much contribute to that. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my honourable friend from Kitchener Centre, I agree he probably has no reason to doubt that the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board can do a decent and adequate, rigorous environmental assessment. Unfortunately, I have personal experience that leads me to know that they don't do any such thing. They are, in a word, slipshod, incompetent, and a very poor board to have any jurisdiction over a national park. The Canadian Nature Federation, Nature Canada, on its website, describes this approach of letting the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board have regulation in a national park as a quote-unquote dangerous precedent. This Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board, Mr. Speaker, ignored expert advice and approved seismic testing during the migration route of grey whales through the Gulf of St. Lawrence. This board misrepresented a multi-stakeholder group, and I was part of it, that worked for 2 years to come up with recommendations for the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It absolutely misrepresented our results in its press release. This board, there's a technical term for this board, Mr. Speaker, it's called Mickey Mouse. This is a dangerous precedent. This clause must be removed.
The honourable member for Kitchener Centre, short answer, please.
Well, Mr.